Hello, Conroe Church. Welcome back to our Wednesday evening study on the Common Rule. We're kind of winding our study down now. Out of 8 lessons, this is going to be number 7. And these have been habits that are really essential habits that you can change a little bit at a time that will truly, truly bring life change to you. I mean, they will make your life better if you adopt these. And I want to remind you, as we talk about habits, just want to make a quick reminder that, our habits actually frame our day. We talk about this pretty often, but they frame our day. 40% of our daily actions really aren't things that we choose to do. They're ingrained habits that we already have. That's almost half of the things we do are ingrained habits. And so if we can change just one or two, and not even dramatically all at once, just a little bit at a time, it can truly start to change our lives in ways that we may not have even thought possible. So as we've gone through this study, The Common Rule by Justin Earley, so there are 4 daily habits and 4 weekly habits. So the 4 daily habits that we've discussed are kneeling prayer, and that's just as soon as you wake up, you hit your knees and you have a very short prayer so that the very first words out of your mouth are to God as you start your day. And then we talked about sharing a meal daily with other people so that we don't get so wrapped up in ourselves and so that we have eyes for others and what's going on in their lives, and we can look for opportunities to be the hands and feet of Jesus to them. And then we talked about 1 hour daily with the phone off, which may be one of the hardest things that we do of all of these because we are so attached to that phone. And 1 hour away from it a day, just completely turning it off, not checking anything, not checking notifications, emails, text, nothing, reading the news, nothing. And how that can really start to buy back an hour of your time that you didn't even realize you were losing. And finally, scripture before phone. So what are the first words that you want spoken into you when you wake up in the morning? Is it going to be the news? Because you know that's going to be bad. No, let it be God's word. Let God speak into you before anything or anyone else speaks into you in the morning, each morning. That's a small habit that can pay huge dividends. So those are the 4 daily habits. Here are the 4 weekly habits that we have started down this path. The first one was 1 hour of conversation with a friend. And it's been a really strange paradox during the coronavirus pandemic that we've been going through the last 6-7 months. It's been really, really strange because we actually have more time, but we are filling it with things that are less valuable. And so one of the things that seems to have gone by the wayside is us really just having conversation with a friend because we've been isolated so much. We know we can't do that in person nearly as easily, although that is easing up a little bit. But just having 1 hour of conversation with a friend where you put your phone away, they're not even around, and being able to engage in someone's life, that's a game changer, not only for you, but for the person that you're speaking with. And then the second weekly habit was to curate our media for 4 hours, and 4 hours is kind of a random number, just a number that he picked. You can pick whatever number you want, but to curate means you go through and you choose what you're going to allow to go into your head. What is it that you're going to allow? Because so many times, just by default, we go down a YouTube rabbit hole and we let things into our mind, or a Facebook rabbit hole, we let things into our minds that we never ever, if we were just thinking about it, making a decision ahead of time instead of on the spot, we never would let ourselves go down those rabbit holes. They're worthless at best, and they're damaging at worst. And so today we come to our 3rd weekly habit. And our 3rd weekly habit, the one we're going to talk about today, is fasting from something for 24 hours. Fasting from something. Food is going to be at the top of that list, but maybe it's something else. We'll talk about that here in just a minute. Fasting from something for 24 hours. So let me ask you a question. When you think about the word fasting, what does that bring to mind? That's probably something that's worth discussing with the people that you're doing the study with, or to stop this video right now and just ponder. What is it that the word fasting brings to mind? What is that? What comes up in your head when you hear fasting? I can tell you about a Bible class that I was teaching years and years ago. It's an adult Bible class, and we're talking about different things, and one of the things that I brought up was fasting. Fasting is not something that we talk about very often in these days in our society. We really don't talk about it nearly as much as that was a common topic for Jesus, but we don't talk about that nearly as much today. So I'm talking about fasting. And one of my buddies raised his hand. He goes, I fasted for a day at my work at my job this last week. Really, tell us about that. She goes, yeah, I got there a little before 8, and I had a lot to do that day. I mean, my list was packed. I knew there's no way I was ever going to get to be able to check off everything on my list. So I got to the office, and I started working at it, and I got so involved in it that I worked straight through lunch. And he said, actually, the next thing I knew, when I looked up, it was after 5 o'clock, and I had totally fasted through lunch. And you got to be careful how you answer someone because you want to affirm them. But the problem with that is that wasn't really fasting. That wasn't fasting. What that was is getting caught up in his work and losing track of time. But it wasn't fasting. Well, I mean, he missed a meal, so why wouldn't it be considered fasting? Well, there's several reasons. I mean, one is that wasn't intentional. Fasting is always intentional. It's always something that you do on purpose. That wasn't intentional. And second is it really didn't have any specific spiritual purpose. Fasting is done for a specific spiritual purpose. There's all kinds of different purposes, but they're all specific and they're all spiritual if we do it the way that Jesus did. And third, and maybe this is the toughest one, and this is where I want to spend a little time today. It's where Justin Earley is going to spend some time, is that kind of fasting really didn't produce any kind of suffering. And suffering is a word that we don't even like to bring up in conversation, much less dive into. But it's a word that's really important to us if we follow Jesus. There's no way we can get around the importance of suffering if we're Christ followers. So what does suffering have to do with fasting? Well, let's think about it this way. I've got a group of about 10 friends. There's about 10 of us. And we have met together once a year for about 2.5, 3 days, every year for about 20 years. We've known each other. We all share kind of a common experience in a camp that we all were a part of one way or the other at ACU when I was in youth ministry. And so for about 20 years, I think it's been 2021 at this point, every year, usually in January, we meet together for about 3 days, and two things happen. We eat the best food ever, and probably too much of it, to be honest. I mean, everybody's favorite candy's there. Every meal is a feast. One of these guys, he's a minister, and he's an incredible cook. And so he makes these gourmet meals every time. We always look forward to dinner. And so we eat. And, I mean, in the last meal, the last dinner we had together, always is this huge steak and potato and bread. And we're always looking forward to that last steak. He just is such a good cook. And so we enjoy eating together, and that's one of the things that we do. We eat. The other thing we do, though, is that we share our lives. So what's gone on in your life over the last year? Where have you seen God really powerfully in your life? And where have you had to just cling to God for dear life? Has there been any suffering? And you know, in the course of those conversations that we have, everyone shares. There's time for everyone to share what's going on in their lives. Inevitably, there's suffering. Inevitably, somebody has gone through something that they've just had to hold on for dear life that has been just so painful. Sometimes there are many tears when things happen that so dramatically impact their lives, when things happen to their kids or miscarriages, or things at their job, or the way they've been treated, or a loss of a loved one. There's so many things that happen that bring tears that have brought suffering in the last year, and we sit with each other in that. And I'll tell you something that's really an interesting comparison between those two. For all the good of the meal that we share together, and all the good of how well we eat on that time together, which again we should probably only do once or twice a year like that. It is such an opposite from the suffering that goes on. You know, from the people who have experienced betrayal, or the people who have experienced loss. You have this great feast, and then you have this great suffering, and it's all together. And fasting is kind of like that. I want to draw it back to fasting. Fasting's kind of like that. You know, we live in this world where really we have everything available to us within the click of a mouse or a trackpad. You know, anything we want, we can get just like that, it can be here in 2 days. If it takes 3 days, we get frustrated. I mean, think of how spoiled we are at this point in our lives where we can get anything we want just like that. And we are spoiled. And there are a lot of good things about that. And there's a lot of things that we can get quickly that we weren't able to get before. And there's a lot of blessing to that. But there also is some downside to that. You know, it's part of the biggest downside is that what that does is it blocks out the fact that there is suffering in this world because we have everything so good. It keeps us from thinking about anybody who doesn't have things just in a snap of a finger. It keeps us from thinking about people who struggle and who suffer. And not everyone has access to that blessing. As a matter of fact, most people in the world don't have access to that kind of blessing. Most people in the world don't get to share in the kind of feast that my little group shares in. There's a lot of the world, probably about half, that doesn't even get to go home and have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich whenever they want it. I mean, there's a lot of different kinds of suffering that we really opt out of when we make ourselves put up this wall between who I am and the suffering that goes on in the world. And you think, well, yeah, maybe I don't want to know about that. But here's the downside. Here's the part where we just can't, if we're going to be Christ followers, we just can't get away from it. The downside is this. When we do that, we miss the suffering of Jesus. We block out the suffering of Jesus. And listen, the suffering of Jesus is central to your Christian walk. Jesus suffered on your behalf. His suffering was on your behalf. It was on my behalf. And we can't just block it out, or else we can't be the people that Jesus created us to be. So let's watch this video. Justin Earley is going to say some fascinating things, and then we'll knock it around for a little bit after the video's over.
Hi, and welcome back to this video series on the Common Rule, Habits of Purpose for an Age of Distraction. The Common Rule is a book about 8 daily and weekly habits designed to form us in the love of God and neighbor. And this video series is a guide to reading the book, discussing the concepts in a community, and most importantly, practicing the habits together. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the 3rd weekly habit, which is the habit of fasting. What we're going to find is that restraint uniquely opens us up to feast on the real food of life, and that is God Himself. The danger we're going to see is that we live in an age of plenty, and it's uniquely possible to convince ourselves that maybe, after all, we can live by bread alone. Here's the reality. We live in a land full of sugar, sex, food, booze, and whatever else you want to try to numb the pain of life. Which is to say that if you live in the culture that I do, you are culturally predisposed to try to eat, drink, or sleep away your pain. And the danger of this kind of living, which is totally normal, is that it numbs us. It numbs us to everything, to who we are, to who God is, to the fact that there is terrible and constant suffering in the world, and to the fact that there is nonetheless persistent and stunning beauty in the world. So to cultivate the practice of fasting as a habit is actually to have our eyes and our hearts opened up to all of this, the good and the bad. And it's important to dwell on the suffering part for a moment, because in a real way, to fast is to suffer. And fasting is thus a way of resensitizing our hearts to the serious reality that we live in a world that suffers. Part of the beauty of fasting, the terrible beauty of it, is we remember that. We remember that there are children in our cities who don't eat. There are millions of refugees in our world that are stuck in inexpressible hells. We remember that there are coworkers in the offices next to us fighting life and death battles with depression. So to cultivate a life of rhythmic fasting is to reject the terrible fairy tale that everything is fine and to actually enter into suffering with Christ and remember how much we long and how much our neighbors long for Christ to redeem all things. The fact is, when we live in this lie that everything's fine, we're tempted to believe the lie that we don't need a Savior. And that is why this practice of fasting is so important. It reminds us of our actual deepest need, our truest need. Here's how this looks in my life. when I'm in my best rhythms, I make Thursday a fast day. And sometimes it's from food, sometimes it's from coffee, sometimes it's from wine. But inevitably, first thing in the day when I wake up and I remember, oh, I'm fasting today, I immediately begin to experience this low-grade anger. And as the day progresses, I get to the point where I might have a meal or a cup of coffee or whatever, and I have to skip it. And I get annoyed. And then the hunger or the headache sets in, and my body begins to get angry, and I just get plain depressed. And this is why. Because I actually am a sad, angry, frustrated, impatient person who medicates with food and drink. And that is the first point of the practice of fasting. You see who you really are. But then what happens is you come out of fasting the next day, maybe you have that cup of coffee or that food, and you know what? It's actually not all that satisfying. It's not as what you remember. It doesn't fill the shape of the hole that you were trying to fill. And in this rhythm of doing this on and off and regularly, you begin to realize the most fundamental truth about yourself and the world. It's that nothing but the love of God can fill the pain of our emptiness. Which is why I say that to live without fasting is to live without knowing who you truly are. Fasting reveals the inner need that only God can fill. And that's the point, to expose the reality of our inner need and see that only Jesus can fill that. So that's the idea behind the weekly habit of fasting. As always, here's your fact to ponder, your question to discuss, and your habit to practice. Fact to ponder. There's a surge of modern research about the health benefits of fasting, but way more important than that is this. In Jesus' main teaching on fasting, he begins with the sentence, when you fast. Really important to note that Jesus assumed something about his followers in fasting. Question to discuss. If you were going to fast from something this week, what would it be and why? And finally, does it scare you? Here's your habit to practice this week. I want you to try a 24-hour fast from something. If you're not ready for food, or if your health is not in the right place for that, don't worry. Try sugar, try social media, try anything. But pick something that you're going to miss and then lean into that lack and see how you meet Christ there. Over the next week, you're going to be reading about the last weekly habit. And when you come back, we're going to talk about that. It's the weekly habit of Sabbath. Finally, remember, as with all of these, your habits will not change God's love for you, but God's love for you can and should change your habits.
So many of you have gone on short-term mission trips sometime in your life. You know, those trips where you go to a foreign country and maybe you'll build a small church building for them, maybe just out of cinder block, and no electricity, no running water, but just a building to shade that group of Christ followers from the sun. Maybe you've done that. Or maybe you went to build a little house, a little shack for someone in a foreign country, where they really just didn't have much. And again, maybe just a little cinder block house, maybe just a 12 by 12 slab that you mix concrete manually in wheelbarrows, and then you pour it, and you build up a little house. And those trips are really, really valuable, obviously, for the people that you go see. But I think that there's a good possibility that many times those trips are even more valuable for us. Many times I think those trips do even more for us, because what they do is they pull back the curtain in our lives on our illusion of what's normal, what we think is normal. Like we look at this, and this is our normal. Well, this is not the normal in most of the world. Most of the world doesn't have this kind of normal whatsoever. And so when we go on those trips, it pulls back the curtain on what we believe normal is, but what normal really isn't. You know, I've had the privilege of going on quite a few mission trips like that. I've gone to a bunch of different places, and I've experienced a lot of poverty in this world. But I'll tell you, the poverty that I think is deeper and more horrifying than any of the poverty I've seen in any of the other countries and places that I've gone to on these mission trips is the poverty in Haiti. Haiti is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. And so I've been to 3 trips to this little village that's about 25 miles outside of Haiti. It's a rock road to get out there. And it takes, and those rocks will just bust tires on all-terrain vehicles that get out there. When I say all-terrain, don't think like what we have here in America. These are really old, torn-up vehicles that you just shake like you think your teeth are going to fall out. And it takes, just to get 25 miles, it may take an hour and a half because the roads are so rough. And there's this little village about 25 miles outside of Haiti, and it is one of the poorest places in Haiti. So this is one of the poorest places in a country that is the poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere. And these people are living in abject poverty. They live in these little shacks that are just fashioned together out of whatever materials that they can get sometimes. And those little shacks can be obliterated in a moment by a flood or an earthquake or a hurricane. And that's how they live. And you know, the people in this little village, they don't ever worry about Wi-Fi connection. We've never had that come up when we were out there. They don't ever think about it. They don't ever have conversations about going, oh man, I just washed my car and now it's raining. They don't have those conversations. They don't wonder how they're going to pay their medical bills. That never comes up because they don't have medical bills. Because the truth of the matter is, there are only 3 hospitals, main hospitals, big commercial hospitals, in all of the country of Haiti. And out there in that village, none of those folks have any insurance. They wouldn't even know what that is. And so if they get sick, they just die. And so often they die from things that you and I could be cured from if we just drove down to Walgreens and got some over-the-counter medication. That's the kind, they don't even think about health care because they don't even know what health care is. That's a foreign concept to them. And yet here with us, right now in this season, we're all arguing about health care and the quality of health care and who should get health care. Those folks that conversation, they wouldn't even know what to do with it. It wouldn't ever cross their mind. So what does that have to do with fasting? Well, as it turns out, it has everything to do with fasting. You know, we live in this land of plenty. We live where we can get what we want. And even the people who live below the poverty line in this country would be considered billionaires in that little village in Haiti. They would be considered mega rich in that little village. And fasting, intentionally doing without something for 24 hours, that kind of fasting, intentionally saying, I'm not going to eat. I'm not going to turn on any technology. Whatever the fasting is, and I would definitely recommend food. That's the kind of fasting that Jesus participated in and he talked about in his ministry, if you can. There are some people who have medical conditions where they really can't go 24 hours without a meal. Can you skip one, though? That kind of fasting actually helps us realign our hearts and our minds and even our souls with God, our Creator. See, because to intentionally do without something that we rely on or something that we take for granted can start a process of being more like Jesus in a way that nothing else can accomplish. Nothing else. And that is through suffering. It's through suffering. And this isn't the kind of suffering that those people in that little village go through. It's far from it. It just makes us a little uncomfortable. But what we do is we take the first step into suffering. You know that group that I mentioned that I meet with every year? You know, like I said, we'll eat these big feasts and everything, and then we'll share in our lives, and suffering always comes up, and there have been people who truly suffer during the year. And you know what? Those big feasts, they're great. They don't take away that suffering. I mean, because there will always, always, always be a kind of pain that you can't soothe by eating. And so when we go away from eating for 24 hours, what it does is it brings enough suffering in, it makes us uncomfortable enough to where we then, after we get over being unhappy about that, we can start thinking about the suffering of others. You know, since sin came into this world, all the way back to the fall of mankind, you know, we have gotten things really, really messed up in that regard. I mean, some of the things that we've done are just absolutely backwards from the way that they should be. I mean, sometimes we take the good things that God's given us Instead of just simply enjoying them as God's gift to us, we actually make those things a God, lower g, little g, instead. We take what God gave us as a gift to enjoy and we make it into a God. Justin Earley says that when Adam and Eve ate the fruit, what they did is they inverted God's gift. In other words, they ate to become God instead of celebrating God. They ate to become God. They wanted to become God. They wanted to be like God instead of just celebrating his gift to them. He also says this. He says in fasting, we start by experiencing that emptiness in our stomachs, but we end up, if we continue doing this as a practice, we end up then experiencing the emptiness of the world around us. And it helps us to recalibrate. And it helps us to recenter. And it helps us to know what's important. It helps us to get back to the things that are the most important in life. That's what it helps us do. It helps us down to the depth of our souls understand that nothing, no amount of food, no amount of success, no amount of money, no amount of pleasure, nothing ever will fill our hearts and souls and minds except Jesus. That's it. And so fasting will eventually take us outside of ourselves, and it'll open our eyes to the suffering in the world, the suffering that so many people have just for the basics of life, the suffering that so many people have outside of Jesus, and it'll open our eyes to our own suffering and our own need for Jesus. It comes full circle. You ever wonder why Jesus started his ministry by fasting for 40 days? Doesn't it seem like a strange way to start? He started his ministry by fasting. And the reason he did that is because it focused him on the things that were going to be crucial for his ministry. That's what it did. It laser focused Jesus on the things that he was going to be about. See, the cross was not the only time that Jesus suffered on our behalf. He suffered at the beginning of his ministry also, as he went through 40 days of fasting. He suffered at the beginning, he suffered at the end, and he did it on our behalf. And so what happens is, in fasting, we actually join Jesus in suffering for the purpose of opening our eyes to those who need us. You know, because in this country, so many more people actually die from excess than die from lack. And as followers of Jesus, we need to not only understand that, but we need to join Jesus in seeing these people that the world doesn't see. And we need to join Jesus in hearing the cries of these people that others don't hear. So let's get practical for a minute. What do you do during fasting? Well, there's a bunch of answers to that, of course. Here's just a few things to consider. One thing is spend some of the time that you would spend in eating in prayer. Spend some time in prayer. It gives clarity. Prayer during fasting will give clarity to some aspects of your life that you really can't get any other way. And of course, you're going to want to let God speak to you during this time, so you're going to want to be in Scripture. But maybe you listen to Scripture and you walk. Maybe that's one of the things that you do too. Maybe you take a walk, and on this walk you go, okay, I'm going to start looking for signs of God that I don't normally look for. I'm going to start looking for him in nature. I'm going to start listening for sounds of God's creation as it coexists with our own creation. I'm going to start looking to see at landscaping of houses, or I'm going to start looking at trees and flowers and plants that God has just grow out in the wild just for our own joy and benefit. Or how about this? What if you used fasting as a time to ask God for forgiveness and strength in some area of sin that has just whipped you over and over and over? That'd be a good thing to do with fasting. Earley says something very sobering about this. He says, once we're drawn into who we are in God, then, after we're drawn in, then we can turn to the world in love. But when we don't, we'll turn to the world looking for love and validation. That's a scary thing. You ever done that? You ever looked to the world for your validation? It's because we're not grounded in Jesus' love for us. All right, so let's repeat this. and then let's shut her down. First, fact to ponder. The teachings of Jesus actually assume that his followers practice fasting. So there in the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 6, he really has three subjects he talks about. And he goes, when you give, do it this way. And he says, and when you pray, do it this way. And he says, when you fast, do it this way. He brings up those three subjects, and his intro to them is exactly the same on all three. When you give, and when you pray, and when you fast. He assumes that his followers practice fasting. We lost something in the last 2,000 years. We might be wise to go get it back. Second, here's a question for us to discuss. So if you were going to fast from something this week, what would it be? And again, I just want to tell you the thing that I know will bring you benefit will be food. If you can't, what would it be? And it has to be something that would scare you a little. I mean, so for example, for me, if someone said, all right, you got to fast from coffee for 24 hours, I'd go, all right, no problem, because I just never have developed a taste for coffee. My wife likes it. I just never have developed a taste for it. So that's not fasting from coffee. I do that every day. It needs to be something that's going to scare you, something that you're going to go, oh man, if technology, oh man, I can't eat, okay, that bothers me. It needs to be something that you're actually giving up that'll cause a little suffering, that'll cause you to really struggle a little bit. And finally, the habit to practice. It's simple. Fast from something for 24 hours. There are many people when they practice fasting, they do it the way the Jews did it originally. Is the Jews would start on Friday evening, and they would start their fast then, and they would fast until Saturday evening. So after dinner until the next day. That's the way the Jews would do it. You can do it that way. You can do it, from the time you wake up until the time you go to sleep, however works best for you. But pick something. Pick something that you're going to do. Pick the item. If it's not food, maybe it's just sugar. Maybe it's social media. Social media has its tentacles in us, I think, sometimes. But you pick something and do it. In these days that we live in, there's great, incredible uncertainty. We don't know what tomorrow's going to bring. And you have 1,000 people, it seems like, yelling in your face, and they're screaming at us, and they want us to believe that they have the right answers to the world's problems right now. Lots of people think they've got it. But the truth is, they don't. They don't. Because there's really only one answer. There's only one right answer, let me put it that way. And that right answer actually exists in the love of and the person of Jesus. And anything outside of that answer is the wrong answer. And so fasting is a very tangible way for us to do something very, very valuable for our soul. It's to center on what has true value. Fasting helps us center on what has true value, and in that we share in a very small way in the suffering of Jesus. We're shaped by his death, and then ultimately we experience the power of his resurrection. So Conroe Church, have a great rest of the week and go in peace.